Everybody, for your homework assignment this weekend, you're going to be practicing writing thesis statements for rhetorical analysis. Now, you already did this when you wrote your Born a Crime analysis papers, but in those papers, you focused on logos, ethos, and pathos. And I've told you along the way that those are modes of rhetoric. That is something that you build, right? You build emotion, you build credibility, or you build a logical appeal. But we need to talk about how to write thesis statements when you need to write an essay about how you build those things. So if you build pathos in a text, there are all sorts of choices that you're making in order to build that pathos. You are using certain words, you're using certain tones, you're creating certain images, using certain metaphors and symbols, etc. So when you're trying to write a thesis statement about those style choices, you don't necessarily need to include logos and ethos and pathos in your thesis statement. In fact, for this assignment, I don't want you to include those three words in your thesis statement. Instead, you're trying to find patterns in the language that you can write about in an essay. So we're going to do this with Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden. Super offensive, but kind of rhetorically juicy poem. A lot of times the stuff that's very offensive, it's kind of easier to find the patterns in that because you find what you hate in it really easily. Sometimes it's easier to write about things that you hate rather than things that you love. So we're going to do that with this essay here, or with this poem. And the argument that I've pulled out for us to work with is colonized people are childish and need more moral guidance from white conquerors. I don't think anyone would argue that that is an argument in this poem. He continually refers to colonized people as children and suggests that it is the white man's burden. Like it's so hard for us, but we've got to do it. As white men, we need to go into this country and show them the light, show them the way, right? That's kind of the attitude that he takes. And just to be clear, by 1899, when this poem was written, and I'm sure we will talk about this in class, but this is not something that should be taken for granted. This is not the way that everyone was thinking. Sometimes when we look at texts like this that are clearly very racist, we think, well, but at the time, this was a normal way to think. No, like it might have been more normalized than now, but it was racist then, and it's racist now. And often it was seen as racist by a good number of people. So anyway, that was just my little disclaimer here, but that's our argument. Our thesis statement will include that argument, but what we need to do is we need to find those patterns that are building that argument. So what you are looking for is which rhetorical strategies does Kipling use to create this argument? And you could think about that as which language choices is he making to create the argument. If you get hung up on like what is a rhetorical strategy, all you're looking for here is when he makes a choice with his language and how that creates, how that helps him persuade his audience, right? So then I am looking at ultimately with this one, I want to look at the tone. Whenever you're looking at a piece of rhetorical text, it's a really good idea to take a look at the tone. And right here, to me, it looks like it's very like sacrificial. Like it's like, it's laudatory, praising white people. And it is praising their efforts, and their efforts he thinks are clearly going to be a burden on them. Then he uses the word burden, obviously. And so I'm thinking that his tone, which is another way of saying his attitude towards his subject, is sacrificial. If his subject is the colonized people, he feels like he needs to take on this like sacrificial sort of burden, right? Okay, so then I want to think about some of the things that he does over and over again. Well, I mentioned one of them. He keeps calling them things like children. They are half devil, half child. A couple of these. Half child was one, obviously, but he also refers to them as simple and sullen, which if you've read or experienced the world, you know that those are words that are usually associated with somebody who is either a child or has a childish brain. You don't usually have if you call an adult sullen, you are saying that they are being childish. So I've pulled out these words that I'm seeing as a pattern throughout the poem, that he keeps referring to them as children. Another thing that he keeps doing in this poem is using alliteration. Alliteration, as I'm sure you remember, is the repetition of sounds at the beginning of words. So you have fill, full, the mouth of famine. Or you have, let me find another one. Really have the alliteration both times he's referring to people as kind of childish. So he says, by open speech and simple, the silent, sullen peoples. So I'm going to kind of take note of that. Silent, sullen peoples and open speech and simple. You get the alliteration there, and you also get, this is a different word that you will hear later, but you get the P sound repeated right there, right? So it's, and the L's here, so that is also called consonants. I will just write it here because maybe you learned something new that day. Consonants. Okay. My brain is fried. I had to look up the spelling of that word. Consonants. All right. Anyway, we're going to call it alliteration, though. That's what I care about here. So we've got him, the pattern of referring to them as children, the pattern of alliteration, and you could stop there and format your thesis based on that, but there's another pattern that I found here that's going to go along with this quite well, which is that he uses this kind of sing-songy rhythm. That's what I'm going to call it. Sing-song rhythm. I told you it, oh my gosh. Oh, hang on a second. I've spelled rhythm now. You are getting too much inside baseball on this and how bad of a speller I am. Anyway, so I'm going to call it a sing-song rhythm. Just so you know, and we will cover this in our poetry unit in a couple months, but this is written in iambic trimeter. So it's actually a planned rhythm. The reason I say it's sing-songy is because of the way that the syllables and the stressed and unstressed syllables work together. So take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. You hear how that rhythm kind of repeats. Now it repeats through the entire poem. There are only a couple points, and you kind of heard it in Exile when that rhythm breaks. So those are my three things that I'm noticing in this. You could notice all sorts of things. You could notice how he refers to people as wild or devilish. You could talk about how he keeps repeating the first line of each stanza, take up the white man's burden. Like there's so many different patterns that he's using this. And the trick with rhetorical analysis and the thing that makes it hard is you have to be creative. And you have to take a step back from the text and think, how is this text persuasive to this audience? And sometimes that is going to be through imagery and metaphor. Sometimes that's going to be through syntax. Like there's just endless numbers of ways that you can make language choices to be persuasive. So there's no hard and fast answers here. You kind of just have to think about it from the audience's perspective and think, why would I be, if I were this audience, and in this case you are definitely not, but if I were this audience, how would I be persuaded by this poem? And one of his audience members, Theodore Roosevelt, was extremely persuaded by this poem. Theodore Roosevelt gave it out to everybody and was like, see, this is why we are going to colonize the Philippines. Like this justifies everything. So this was clearly a very rhetorically effective piece for some people. So now I want to write the thesis statement. And what I need to do is I need to combine my patterns with my argument. So I might say something like, Kipling uses alliteration and a sing-song rhythm combined to reference to, let's say, to represent the colonized people as children, making the argument that colonized people as children need moral guidance from white conquerors. Okay, now you watched me, I did that on purpose. You watched me kind of play with the language a little bit. This is a lot of information to fit into one sentence. Thesis statements, especially for rhetorical analysis essays, can be 2 sentences. Not more than 2, but they can be 2 sentences because you need to include both parts. The strategies that he's using and the, I'll write this right here, strategies plus argument. So you are saying what argument he makes and how the argument is persuasive. So here I have Kipling uses alliteration and a sing-song rhythm. And again, if you knew the terms for it, iambic trimeter, you could, but it works just as effectively to describe what you're seeing, even if you don't know the vocabulary word for it. So Kipling uses alliteration and a sing-song rhythm to represent the colonized people, to, let's say, represent colonized people as children, making the argument that colonized people as children need moral guidance from white conquerors. We could even say that childish colonized people need moral guidance from white conquerors. I mean, play with the language, see if you can cut it up, but you could also make it 2 sentences and say, represent colonized people as children. He makes the argument that, there you go, 2 sentences. So you have a little bit of room to play with that, but the main point that you should remember is that you need the strategies in there. So in other words, the language choices, I'm going to put that right here, the language choices he makes in the poem, plus the argument. How is this persuasive to his audience? And who the audience is and what the tone is and and the context, that's all going to be in the introduction, right? That's the soapstone stuff. So this is really all you need in a thesis statement. All right, so you are now going to give this a try for yourself with some different texts.